When we think back to the era of World War II and the atrocities that were committed by Nazi Germany and Poland, do we ever wonder how and why those came to be? Well, today we're going to take a look at how the events during the Black Plague helped cause one of the largest genocides in human history nearly 600 years later in the Holocaust. So let's take a deep dive into the connections and correlations between these two events. Now you may be asking yourself, how does one go from the 1340s all the way to the 1940s? Well, let's start with the obvious, and that humans are always looking for reasons to blame others for the problems that there are in society. Well, let's start with the obvious, and that humans are always looking to blame others for the reason why things are the way that they are. An example would be witch hunts, whether it would be social or local issues that people were always looking for answers for. But of course, it is, always easier to blame the crazy white Karen with 3 black cats in your town for all of its problems. Just saying. But 90% of the time, it would be simple things, but because we, as humans, did not understand why things were happening at that point in time the way that they were, we'd always point our fingers at the easiest possible target. And that was the case with the Black Plague came to the doorstep of Europe in 1347. And within a couple of years, it had spread all across Europe. This, of course, would lead to mass fatalities all across Europe. And with all the death, people of Europe began to looking for who, what, where, why, and how this massive event had happened. And eventually the Christians settled on the lepers and the Jews. Now, it was believed that the Jews were going around and poisoning the wells at the common drinking areas and other water sources to make Christians sick. Add in the fact that it's believed that the Jewish people were not as affected by the Black Plague due to their hygienic and religious practices, as well as not using the communal wells around most towns. And on top of that, the Jewish people on average were wealthier, more educated, and healthier by the standards of the day. It's crazy to think how just simply showering and washing your hands can keep you sick, but once again, this was before germ theory was invented. With the blame now set on a select group, many massacres ensued, with the first taking place in Toulon, France in 1348. The city sacked the Jewish quarter, and it's believed that roughly 40 Jews were murdered in their homes. Shortly after, many more massacres and sackings happened all across southern Europe along the Mediterranean, especially near Barcelona. Then in 1349 is when things began to really escalate. There were massacres in Erfurt, Germany, where between 1,000 and 3,000 Jews were killed between March 21st and 22nd. Then there was the Zurich massacre, where over 80% of the Jewish population was killed, and all the debt was void, as well as all the material goods were stolen and confiscated. 1, 2, 3. Then there was the Zurich massacre, where over 80% of the Jewish population of the town was killed, and all the debt that was owed to the Jewish people was voided, as well as all the material goods and wealth was confiscated by the townsfolk. They also burnt down the castle that the Jewish people were hiding in for safety. And I think in today's term, we'd call that a peaceful protest, but that's neither here nor there. Another was the Basel massacre, where between 50 and 600 Jewish people were killed. Sources do vary drastically, however, as it's based on the time frame of when it was looked at. So in more modern times, we're looking at it being a smaller number, where in post times it was a much bigger number. It got to the point where some communities tried to defend themselves, and ultimately all would be slaughtered in some cases. Other communities, however, would either kill themselves or burn their houses down with them still inside to either avoid execution or forced baptism. With all that was going on, Poland's King Casimir III, also known as King Casimir of Poland the Great, enthusiastically gave protection to the Jewish people who were seeking refuge, and those in Poland who violated it were threatened with death. This included things like murder, kidnapping kids, or forcing those who were Jewish descent to Christianity. Part of why the king offered such refuge was in part to help Poland's economy become more of a thriving nation. As is said before, the Jewish people were more wealthy, educated, and stuff like that, and this in part led to the height of the golden age of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 16th and 17th century. But Poland also did not suffer from the plague nearly as much as the rest of Europe, and this is likely in part due to colder weather in the area, as well as the city or the country being locked down But Poland also did not suffer from the plague like its counterparts to the west, this in part to being mostly rural farming towns, as well as limiting trade and outside connections with Western Europe. It is rumored that Poland also had a much cooler summer during this time frame, which did not allow the fleas carrying the plague to survive and thrive nearly as much as it had in the rest of Europe. By the mid-18th century, Poland was home to the largest number of Jewish people, nearing 750,000 people. Now we get to more modern day, and it's 1939 before the outbreak of the Second World War, where there are 3.3 million Jewish people in Poland. And as we all know, on September 1st, 1939, Adolf Hitler invaded Poland, trying to gain more Lebensraum, or living space for the Aryan/German people. By the 8th, Germany was already at the gates of Warsaw, which then became subject to a 21-day siege. At the time, Warsaw had about 400,000 Jewish people living there, all of who were forced into a ghetto that was roughly 1.3 square miles, which is roughly the size of Central Park in New York City. There were 10-foot high fences that were constructed and walls built all around the ghetto, and they lined it as much as possible with barbed wire at the top. Travel in and out was mostly prohibited unless you had a pass. Food was so scarce that they were only being given 800 calories a day, and many kids had to dig under walls or climb them or climb through the sewers. And that was mostly in part because they were small enough to fit through the holes in the walls or in the sewer system to come in and out of the ghetto. Others would bribe guards and people outside of the ghetto for food and pharmaceutical supplies that were in dire need. However, unfortunately, they were mostly taken advantage of, and the highest bidder a lot of times would be who they would pick. Many homes did not have running water, and on top of that, there were only about 5 bathhouses located all around the ghetto available for all these people. Now, all this last part is according to the Wiener Holocaust Library, which is one of the largest and longest documenters of the Holocaust. On July 22nd, 1942, the Nazis started to deport roughly 350,000 or so inhabitants to concentration camps. And then by 1943, the word had spread that these camps were extermination camps, and many defied orders of being deported and would rather die in the ghetto fighting than in the concentration camps. This ultimately led to more force being used in the ghetto to tying up essential troops that could be used on the Eastern Front to quell the Warsaw Uprising. Unfortunately, though, at the end of the day, the uprising failed and many Jewish people died, and a lot of people just suffered. They would torture and all those things to the innocent people, even if they weren't necessarily combatants. After the war, the population of the Polish Jews was around 250,000 people, and a lot of people just stopped identifying as Jewish people altogether and focused more on either their Polish identity or wherever else they came from. And with the creation of Israel, as well as many others not identifying anymore or just leaving the synagogue altogether and the religion, that number today is dropped down to roughly 17,000 people that identify as strictly Jewish, not of faith, but of Jewish descent. Now, if you've stayed this far, I'm not doing this video because of the events today in Gaza, between Gaza and Israel, nor am I necessarily taking sides. I just want to do a video on some darker history that I feel like many have never heard of. Now, myself, I was introduced to this topic through the History of Everything podcast with Stephen Bell and his wife, Gabby. They kind of touched on this. I don't remember when, but I remember hearing about it about 6 months to a year ago, and I've done some digging into it, and while this is a very short snippet, I felt like it's a great topic to cover. Now, going back to the Israel-Gaza situation, I know a lot of history's prior events have led to very unfortunate circumstances in later times, and unfortunately, we won't know the exact outcome of how this war is going there. That said, we probably could tie all this back into the Black Plague, and if not further back with the persecution of Jews throughout the post-500 AD time frame with the collapse of Rome. Anyways, I'd like to take this opportunity to say thanks for watching and taking the time out of your day to watch this brief history story. My goal is to keep these videos about anywhere between 10 and 20 minutes long with a brief outline of events in history that ultimately people like myself who, work in a labor industry could listen to either on our way to and from work or on our breaks. So like I said, thanks for watching, taking your time, and be safe out there. Bye.